In this short movie, I'm going to show you how to convert a color image to a dramatic black and white image. The photograph itself is too flat, and this was my end result, which I think is, it sparkles, it has a lot of great effects in there, and I will now show you how I got from this point to this point. First, let's begin by looking at the attributes of this photograph, because it does have some good points. One of them is that the eye that's closest to the camera is in sharp focus, and that's important because we need that to happen. The depth of field doesn't extend very far. You can see that his hair sideburns and are completely out of focus, and his other eye is not quite as sharp, and of course the background is very indistinct from short depth of field. But what we've accomplished is to get the eye that's closest to the camera in focus, and that is very important. Another item about this shot that I didn't really like is the color of his shirt is very bright green, and it was the dominant color in this photo. And I wanted to have these highlights that are up here on his forehead. I wanted to have his eyes bright. I wanted to show the silvery quality of his hair here, and that shirt just seemed to take away from all of that. So in this process, we're going to, besides add the silvery quality to his hair and beard and make sure that we have nice clean highlights here and brighten up his eyes, we're also going to darken the shirt. Okay, so let's begin with this by converting this image to a black and white. Because I have shot it in RAW, it opens up in Camera Raw. Don't worry if you haven't shot your images in RAW. You can always still use Camera Raw as the utility to convert your images to black and white by just downloading the free application Camera Raw from the internet, from the Adobe website, and then installing it into your Photoshop version. It'll install in Elements and the regular version of Photoshop. If you have Photoshop now or Elements, you may find that Camera Raw is already installed. And again, you can open up JPEG images with Camera Raw. I convert it to grayscale, and I want to get rid of that green shirt, so I just dial down the green there. I like everything else in the photograph. I am going to increase the exposure a little bit. There we go. It's already looking a little better. And I'm going to increase the contrast by lowering the shadow detail, making the shadows darker. I'm going to bring up the highlights just a little bit. Notice that if I take the highlights up too hot, I'll lose detail in his beard. But that looks pretty good. If the highlights in the beard get a little too hot, I can dial back the whites, but they look pretty good. And again, I'm just going to dial back these blacks ever so slightly, and that's give us a little bit of contrast in some of the areas that we want it. Right here, we don't want any of that detail. We don't really need much of that detail. We want him to kind of pop off that image. And let's look at bringing up the highlights just a little bit more. We're already getting some of that silvery effect. Okay, let's open that image. Okay, so let's look at, this is the image we're working on currently, and that was our final that I completed before I started this recording. So I think we can still bring up some of the silvery portions there. So what I'm going to do is I am going to make a layer duplicate. So I'm going to go to Layer, I'm going to duplicate layer, and I'm going to call this contrast layer. What gives us the kind of silvery quality of the hair and areas that are in the shadow portions is a lot of contrast. So I have a separate layer there, and I'll turn that layer on and off. They look exactly the same. But when I make adjustments to that layer, we're going to see that that layer starts getting very contrasty. Can you see that? So it's ruining this portion of the face, but it's making its glow right here nicely, and that's the area that we want to come alive. So with and without that contrast change, we can see that. And now we want to get rid of the areas that are burned up and keep in the layer the areas that have that kind of silvery glow. So we use the erase tool, make it kind of big, dial back the opacity to about 25, and we are now going to erase the burned up areas. Now that looks pretty good. We want to recover as much of the area in his beard as we can, so we're going to dial the size of our erase tool back a little bit, and we're going to turn up the opacity to 100% and just remove everything on the layer that we've made there. Okay, so now let's take a look at our two layers. This was our original layer, and it was pretty flat down back here, and now we have added contrast and depth to the photograph. We would be okay at this point. This was the finished layer, the finished image before we started. I'm actually thinking that the new one that we created has a little bit more pop to it. I'm looking in his eyes, and I'd like to brighten up his eyes just a little bit because I like the quality that we had here in the previous image. So let's now do that. I'm going to make another duplicate layer. I'm going to call this eye lightening. And we are going to do an interesting thing, and I found this to be very helpful. I'm just going to use the lasso tool, and I'm going to remove everything else. Now I've got the lasso tool. I'm going to invert my selection and take that away. Let's look at what we have in that layer. That's all we have in that layer now. And what we're going to do is increase the contrast and the brightness in that layer. I'm going to increase the brightness and the contrast. We don't want to go too far because it'll look phony. But that's with and without that. That might be a little much. Okay. We're okay with that. And now, as in the past, I'm going to erase what it is that I don't want to use, because I made a very quick selection, and now I'm going to erase what I don't need. Okay. Let's turn that layer on and off. Big difference. Let's take a look at it at full size. So it fits in the screen. A big difference, especially on the eye that's on to the right of the image. So that's the image that we've been working on. This was the one that I had done before I started this little movie. I actually like the newer one better. It's got the silvery quality in his hair, and his eyes are bright, but it has a slightly darker background. So I like that one a little bit more. So we could still brighten up this part of his hair a little bit, and that was this contrast layer. You can see that. I may just brighten that up a little bit. If we want to increase the contrast, one of the best ways to do it is to make a duplicate layer again. And as before, we increase just the contrast here and a little bit of the brightness. And we erase what we don't want. There are Photoshop artists that do this completely different. We all have our different methods. Oops, let me back that. I erased the wrong part. I want to erase everything else except for that area. Let's see if that helps. A little bit. Adds a little bit of contrast there. Okay, I think we have a finished image. Again, this was the image that I had created before. That was the corrected image. This is the one that we just created, and this is what we started out with. And as you can see, it just doesn't have the pop, and that's our final image.